we ask ourselves, how is this going to continue? How is democracy as we know it going to continue? What about multilateralism? What about the great challenges that we see in the area of sustainability here? First and foremost, obviously, climate change and the consequences this may have. For example, people fleeing their home countries, civil strife, violence, conflicts. The sheer range of issues that you deal with and that I mentioned is global in nature. And as I see it, and I believe that most people actually share this assessment, they can only be solved if we not only go it alone nationally and feel that we are a community of shared responsibility nationally, but if we look at the whole world and see ourselves as an international community that shares certain values. Easier said than done, because it is quite true that already on the national stage we sometimes have a difficulty to understand what shared responsibility means. We here in the Federal Republic of Germany, as you know, have a federal system. Sometimes it's not all that easy. So you see the local level, local authorities, you see them trying to bring about some kind of community of shared values with the Länder level or the regional level, the national level. And if you project that to the whole world, it's an incredible challenge for each and every one. So this slogan, thinking globally, acting locally, may perhaps be some kind of guideline for all of us and an appropriate response, because not each and everyone can at every moment in time understand where he or she stands on this. But I think we do need this feeling of a shared responsibility for the fate of our globe, of our world. And we have to ask ourselves how we can translate this into actively shaping our world, putting the necessary energy into this. And I believe it's quite obvious to all of us. Once we have understood this concept of being in the world of and sharing responsibility, this means that each and everyone has to act together in a multilateral approach. That means we sit down at table and discuss and try to find a compromise and try to forge a common position. So I myself have not only to understand my own position, but also the position of our partners, put myself into the other person's shoes, look a little bit beyond the pale. And that means, as I said, putting myself into the shoes of others, understanding the line of argument, understanding my own vested interest and understand the vested interest of others, and then forge a compromise. So I will not tire saying whoever stands up for the concept of multilateralism also needs to understand that a compromise is necessary and needs to deal with that sensibly, because I will not get 100% of what I want. A compromise, at least as I have always seen it in my political work and continue to do so, in a compromise, the advantages need to outweigh the disadvantages, but it will never be 100% happiness for one side of the table. Each and everyone will feel some mild, disappointment. A little bit will be lacking, but it is a value added in the sense that we have more than just what one person has. That, after all, is the purpose of multilateralism. But multilateralism is a bit under siege because we see a concept resurfacing where people say, oh, it's such hard work, it's so arduous, it's not perfect, and if I go it alone, if I forge my own national policy, I will get out of this more for myself, more for my people. So in a way, it's a competition between two different rules of thoughts. And that's something that we need to go into. There is not really that much room for compromise. Do I see this as my own national go-it-alone possibility, or do I see a possibility of trying to enlist others and their support? It's a bit regrettable to see this event because it's just 10 years that we left the global financial and economic crisis behind us. At the time, the G20 were established at the level of heads of state and government. Until that point in time, it was an instrument of the ministers of finance. I remember very well a telephone call with George Bush, and we said what we need is a global response to this global crisis. So what we then did in this interim period between George Bush's presidency and the election of Barack Obama, for the first time we met in the US at the time, and each and everyone said, well, we'll give a boost to our economy. We try to find solutions for banking regulation. So we tackled the immediate root causes, but also wanted to tackle the underlying causes. And China, at the time, played a very important role because they really gave a boost to their economy with 1.3 billion inhabitants. If you forge such a policy, then this is very effective. We others obviously also did it. But that went a long way towards seeing to it that the global economy did not slow down even more. We emerged out of that crisis in this way. And in the beginning, we found possibilities then also to adopt rules and regulations. We said never again must a player, a product, and all of the different elements of the financial market be without a regulation. Then there was, in a way, a sort of backlash. People were asking themselves, once everything went smoother, are we not perhaps better off going it alone? Because it's true that international fora trying to find solutions there is arduous, is complicated, but I do believe that we need to forge ahead with the G20 process. And you, I believe, pay tribute to this. I think, this is in this forum, try to find a reconciliation between different interests. Now, we need to reform, obviously, international institutions. We have come strongly forward in favor of this, first and foremost of the World Trade Organization. When we met last in Argentina in the format of G20, we agreed with the United States of America on a WTO reform. It is true that so far we have no agreement yet on the shape and form that this is to take. But what is most urgent with WTO is obviously the dispute settlement system, because if the panelists of this dispute settlement panel are not appointed, then this whole thing falls flat. That's true. Now, we have to admit also that the general malaise of reform of international organizations obviously has not only started now in this new American administration, but I remember that Barack Obama and I discussed time and time again WTO agreements, international trade agreements, until a certain point in time where we said, well, maybe we need to concentrate first on bilateral trade agreements. These bilateral trade agreements actually mushroomed, and the European Union too has adopted a whole series of such bilateral trade agreements. They are good, but they're actually only second best. The best solution would be an overall solution for the whole of the world. But it's true, about 180 countries will have to come together and strike a compromise and come to a consensus on that issue and how we deal with data. Because for this, we have no multilateral, no international regulation at all. On the European scene, we can do things in this respect, but the agenda is a very important piece of the mosaic that we need in order to address the ethical issues of artificial intelligence into play. As I said, takes a very long time. It's very slow to actually reform international organizations. For example, the capital increase with the IMF, the quota in the World Bank. All of that has taken a long period of time. It's still ongoing at a time where there is a shift shift in the balance of forces, a little bit like in the history of our planet as we know it. All of a sudden, due to the shifting of tectonic plates, a mountain emerges where there used to be a valley. And that is similar to the shift of the balance of forces between the United States of America, that has an enormous economic clout, and on the other hand, China, but also other emerging Asian powers. India at some point in time will also be up there. So how do we deal with this? Do we say, oh, this order as we know it is something that we don't wish to change? We will work against this, putting our all into avoiding such a shift of tectonic plates? Or do we say, well, in a way, this is also the result of efforts that other countries have made, and it's a development that we need to deal with, obviously in a sensible manner, but also in an honest and candid manner. We should not fight this as if we were in a battle. So 30 years after the fall of the Iron Curtain, we thought that this competition between different systems was won by democracy, but now we have a tremendous challenge, because obviously we are in a systemic competition with China. But our answer cannot be that those who are economically strong are our enemies. We have to fight against them, but we have to work rather for fair, for reciprocal rules, and not give up the multilateral system. I think that should be the order of the day. And what we see now, and you can see that when you look at the debate that we had over TTIP here in Germany, this trade agreement with the United States, that the complexity of this competition of different systems cannot be explained by saying, okay, let's say we all draw this down to zero. We draw down tariffs, non-tariff barriers to trade can be done. But what's difficult is when we get into the area of non-tariff barriers to trade. Tariffs are relatively easy to solve. For example, different standards, new technologies. I say this only when whoever applies this technology will be allowed to fly with, let's say, American or Chinese or German planes. That's a trade barrier that has nothing to do with tariffs, but you can only, for example, sell your own security equipment for airports, and nobody else is allowed to handle passengers anymore because you define the technical standards. And then we said, well, non-tariff barriers of trade start with social security systems, with our environmental rules. All of these are rules that in a way can be defined in such a way as to exclude others. We cannot use tariffs to define that, but they are barriers. Now we have a social discussion, all of a sudden a social debate, where people say, but economists know nothing about our environmental rules. All of a sudden we're supposed to buy chlorine chickens. And that was just one example of the debate we had. So these great issues of multilateralism will be non-tariff barriers to trade. How do we deal with this? Which is why the whole range of issues we deal with in G20 has broadened. We're not only dealing with financial market regulation, with tariffs, we're also dealing with climate protection, with environmental rules, with social minimum standards, with the value added in, for example, textile products, all the way from a factory in Bangladesh to Germany, and with health issues that too have a tremendous impact on the development of a certain country. So I think we can safely say that Germany at the time, during its G20 presidency, tried to broaden this range of issues we deal with, and we're delighted to know that Japan is taking over a number of these issues. World health plays a role. The role of women in societies will continue to play a role, which I think is of tremendous importance in my mind. Even the highly developed industrialized countries, but also the African countries, for all of them, this issue is of prime importance. How do they develop their opportunities? And climate protection, obviously. In Japan, they have thankfully put this at the very top of the agenda. On climate issues, and we see this when we see young people all over the world demonstrating in the interest of combating climate change, has a lot to do with how do we deal with our future responsibility, how do we deal with sustainability. So no, not only do we want to do something on our own, no, rather do we want to come together? Will we want to come out of this non-tariff, out of these tariff issues, but come to non-tariff barriers to trade? And similar with climate change, not only try to agree on rules that are valid for this century, for these decades, but for the coming decades and the coming centuries, which is difficult for people who think in terms of legislative terms or in election, or think until the next election. But as regards how do we deal with data, for example, it's similar for climate change. Basically, we need global solutions. A financial transaction tax, a poll tax can be adopted perhaps here, but you will have a tax that is very limited in scope, because otherwise you have competitive distortion and market participants will simply go away. You will have more hazard. So we have to think of possible incentives in the area of climate change. Theoretically speaking, CO2 pricing is the best possible instrument. We also see a certain increase in CO2 emissions trading systems, for example, in Latin America, in certain federal states of the United States, in certain parts of China, in Europe. We do have a so-called ETS system, but for the non-ETS area, for example, transport, for example, buildings, for example, agriculture, it would make a whole lot of sense if we adopt a global approach. And the question, obviously, is always how big ought to be, how large ought to be the scope of this system in order to make sense. If it's only then leading to also here moral hazard, where people simply shift responsibility to a different country, then it doesn't make sense. So we have to also concentrate on those areas, on the non-ETS, where we have to try and find reductions. We have the huge task here to reach the climate targets for 2030. We will have to adopt legislation in order to make this possible. We will set up a so-called climate cabinet. We will adopt a series of laws on climate protection, but we're faced with huge challenges. For example, on transport, Germany is a transit country. All of the emissions that result from filling up your car here in Germany, be it somebody from Poland, from Belarus, from somewhere else, if somebody fills up his or her car here or truck, it will be sort of calculated against reduction targets. So all of these emissions per vehicle in all of these past years, ever since 1990, have always led to a situation where we did not have a reduction in our emissions, because it was swallowed up by an increase in transport. So if 2030, we would have to say, if by 2030 we would have to have a reduction of 42%, this can only be reached by electromobility with the old systems of internal combustion. This will not be possible. Ladies and gentlemen, I could talk about a whole host of other projects, but I look at the clock here, and that is a disciplinary factor. So I could talk at great length about a whole host of issues, but what's most important for me to mention within the limit of time is the challenge that Africa poses for us. We have seen enormous strides that Africa has made as regards growth, but they have not yet reached a point where the situation is satisfactory. But I think the African Union has become much more self-confident. So we should not have this paternalistic view of Africa. We should consider Africa truly as our partner in the proper sense of the word. So listen to their ideas. ask them to show ownership, as a readiness to actually identify with certain global objectives. Sometimes we should also keep our mouths shut because we sometimes feel we know it better. We've gone through all those stages. They should listen to us. We can teach them. That, as we know, already doesn't work with raising our own children. So we shouldn't try it, perhaps, with adults in other continents. And we should encourage them. We should encourage those leaders of Africa to have trust in their own civil society. I mean, Africa is such a young continent. We, Germany, are a comparatively old one here in Berlin. And this creativity, this readiness of young people also to think in much larger, in much longer time frames, that is something that can be an inspiration also for us. It can also give us an impetus to change. And that is something that we don't have as yet to a sufficient degree in Europe. So a lot of work on our plate. I am more than ready later on in the discussion to elaborate on a number of points. But I think on the whole, one can safely say we have to strengthen the voice of multilateralism in this broad spectrum of challenges. Politicians alone cannot do this on their own. We need a strong civil society to support us. So that's why I'm so gratified to know that this year, apparently, you have had a huge audience participation, and I hope that people will go back home and then talk to other people and try to spread the message. And saying that, although I know that there are differences of opinion between NGOs in the environmental sector, but also in other areas where they are politically active, let us always look at what we wish to do together, what our objectives are that we share. And where we say, obviously, there is a certain tension there, but let us show a common approach, a common front in the interest of multilateral approaches. Any other course will not only fail, but will lead to more strife, will lead to more conflicts, to more violence, to a situation which we in Europe arguably haven't had for 70 years. Attempts to solve issues militarily. I think that certainly is a lesson we in Europe have learned over the past decades. Rather should we turn to the more complicated approach of multilateralism.